introduce our speaker. This is the fifth in our series of lockdown talks, and I'm delighted to introduce Nick Rank, who is our Cathedral Architect. He's been with us for many, many years, and he's also architect to Lincoln and Carlisle cathedrals and to a number of major churches, as well as being a director of Buttress Architects, and for the last 10 years a member of the Cathedral Fabric Commission for England. This talk is part of our Leaves of Southwell Project outreach, which is funded by the National Lottery Heritage Fund, and we're trying to offer a wide range of topics, all connected in some way to the project. So you'll hear a little bit more from me later when we get to the questions. I think Nick is going to talk for about 40-45 minutes, and we're aiming to finish at around 3 o'clock. It may overrun a little bit, as it did last week if you were here, but I do hope you enjoy it. And I'm now just going to pass over to Nick.
Thank you very much. Can everybody hear me okay? Right. In a second, I'm going to start a PowerPoint presentation, which has lots of illustrations in it, and I hope the technology works satisfactorily. As has already been hinted at, this is a lockdown presentation. If we hadn't had the pandemic with us, we would have been able to have open days into the chapter house, drawing the progress of the work. So in a sense, this is a substitute for that, and what I'm going to do is to show you illustrations of the progress of the work through the project in the chapter house, and give you a little bit of background of what we're doing. In a sense, any conservation work that architects and contractors, conservators do, doesn't want to leave an obvious mark afterwards. When we finish this project, in many ways, we want you to be able to go back into the chapter house and say, well, nothing's changed. That's because we'll have done a good job in actually protecting and securing the future of the chapter house, but not damaging or destroying any of the things we appreciate about it. But what we need to be able to do is to make sensitive and careful changes that bring the future of the chapter house forward into the next generation of its history and life. And what we hope to be able to do with this project is to enhance and extend the use of this to the cathedral building. What I want to do is to go into the PowerPoint presentation, which can you all see that? Oh, I hope everybody can see that okay. A slight bit of cheek in the title that I gave this session. The first thing I wanted to do is actually a little personal anecdote. Many years ago, actually many decades ago now, when I was at school doing my A-levels, one of the subjects I did was A-level art. And we had 3 papers in the exam, 2 drawn and painted papers, and 1 a written paper, which was on aspects of history. And the option that my school took was history of architecture, from the medieval through to the Renaissance, and came to a period when we were studying the Gothic architecture of England. And my father, who was also an architect, said, well, the best thing to prepare you for this is let's go and visit the 2 finest Gothic buildings in the country. And so we set off in our Austin A40 car and drove to Lincoln in the morning and then into Southwell in the afternoon, particularly to visit the chapter house. Now, if I take control, and he knew what he was doing, because on his bookshelves he had a copy of Pevsner's book written in 1945 on the Leaves of Southwell, which was one of the most significant books in putting the chapter house into its historical international context. But of course, Pesner wasn't the first person to appreciate the chapter house. The quote there, York Chapter House, is then but a copy of Southwell, which is a bit of a poke in the eye for York Minster, was actually written by Francis Bond over a century ago, who was one of the most eminent historians and writers on Gothic architecture in England. Another book on my father's bookshelves was this volume. This is his volume, which I've now inherited, of Pesner's Buildings of England, Nottinghamshire, which has this wonderful little sketch of the west front of the cathedral on the front cover. And Pesner knew what he was writing about. He chose out of all the counties to start writing for, to concentrate on Cornwall for his first volume, and then in the same year, in 1951, brought out his volume on Nottinghamshire. And Pesner, as the most eminent architectural historian in the early post-war years, realised the significance and importance of the cathedral. And it was a tremendously exciting opportunity for me as a young, impressionable teenager to be brought to visit the chapter house. And this is what he said: "You find the Leaves of Southwell fresh and resilient, lustily spreading over the capitals, over the tympana, crockets, finials of the gables, over all the vaulting and bosses." That's a quote from the Leaves of Southwell. And what Pesner was doing was promoting the chapter house at Southwell as a space not of national but of international importance, and he compared it and related to work that was going on across Europe in terms of Gothic architecture and carving. We might think of it as being a quite small space, but it's a space which Pesner and half a century earlier Francis Bond thought were highly significant and important spaces. And so when the opportunity came for me to be appointed cathedral architect and have the chance of working in the chapter house, you can imagine what an exciting opportunity that was for me. And it's been a tremendous privilege as the architect involved in this aspect of the project to be working on some of the finest carving that you can imagine in Western Europe. So what are we doing in the chapter house? None of you will have been in there for a very long time because of the building work which started back in the middle of last year, in the middle of lockdown. So here's a reminder of what it looked like a year or so ago before any work started. What we're wanting to do is to enhance opportunities for appreciation, enjoyment and use of the space. And the project that we've got going at the moment isn't just involving the physical space itself, the stones and mortar that is around us, but also involves others who are going to be doing heritage interpretation, explaining the history, giving educational opportunities for children and so on. So it's a very rich and multi-layered project. But today I'm going to just concentrate on the architectural, the building aspects of the project, and show you some of the things that you've not been able to see during the lockdown period. So the key objectives that I have been involved with is to conserve and protect the carvings, to enable enhancement and interpretation, and to increase access and use of the space. And what I'm going to do now is take you through a series of slides, a sort of sequence, a time lapse sequence, as it were, of what we have been able to do. The first thing is that once the project came live and the funding was made available for us to do it, we needed to thoroughly understand what we were actually dealing with. And so we initiated a series of detailed and quite specialist surveys. The first thing that in terms of actual physical work was we lifted up some of the stone floor in the chapter house because we'd no idea what lay underneath the stone slabs that we walk on. And I think we can honestly say we were surprised to find underneath the floor a very hard, dense concrete slab, which our consultant archaeologist thinks could have been there since the 1600s, possibly. The view is that the chapter house has such fine carvings in the walls that the floor itself in medieval times would have been equal high status, possibly encaustic tiles with a very rich pattern. That, of course, has been lost, and the floor that we have now was only put down in the 19th century restoration, but we'd no idea what was underneath. So we took out 3 sections of floor and to find this dense, heavy concrete slab that possibly had been cast sometime after the Reformation, and then possibly had been left as the main floor that people walked on. The second thing we did was to do some detailed surveys, produce very precise, accurate drawings of the interior of the chapter house, which we could then use to mark up the repair work and conservation work that we wanted to do. Now, the illustration here on the left-hand side, the long one, is in the slipe, the passageway which leads from the chancel area through into the chapter house. And of course, it looks like a photograph, but in fact, this is a laser scan because you couldn't photograph that space like that. It's too wide for a camera to be able to take in. But this is a laser scan that's pieced in, that on our computers we can enlarge up to full size and see every stone in great detail. So one of the exercises that's gone on is that we've had a specialist stone conservation company who very carefully analysed the whole of the condition of the stonework inside to prepare recommendations for the repair work that we need to do. And then thirdly, we have started to monitor the environment inside the chapter house. This is a progress photograph taken in the latter part of last year. And in the middle, you see a little pink stick. That actually has got a little aerial on it, like a radio aerial, which is attached to a monitor that is surveying both the temperature and the humidity inside the chapter house. And it's then been relayed back to a specialist firm of conservators based in Cambridge who are monitoring the temperature and humidity inside the building so that we can start to understand what problems exist with the masonry. And in a second, I'll show another slide to explain that. Forget about the condition of the floor at the moment. I'll come back to that. Then the other thing, and I don't have a slide of this, is but if you go into the churchyard and walk around the chapter house and look very carefully, you will see 3 little grey plastic caps set into the grass around the chapter house. They are over boreholes about 10 meters deep, which we've drilled down into the ground outside to understand where the water runs around the cathedral and why we get problems of salting, which we see a lot of. I will show you that. You'll be very familiar with views inside the chapter house, and if you look carefully, well, you don't need to look that carefully, you can see very clear white staining. Those stains are salts which are being drawn up by moisture through the walls, and then as they come out and if the moisture evaporates, leaves salts on the surface. Now you can brush the salts off, that's fine, but what you can't do is to reverse the damage that they've caused. As the salts crystallize, they fracture the surface of the stone. And this is one of the big problems that we have throughout the whole of the Minster, is problems of moisture inside the stonework evaporating and causing what we call efflorescence, causing a deterioration of the stonework. And so an exercise that we're doing is to try and understand where this moisture is coming from. Is it coming up out of the ground? Is it coming through leaks in the roofs of the building, which we don't believe it is? Or is it coming through salts that have always been in the stonework right from the day that the stone was quarried back in medieval times? So this is another detailed survey exercise which we have been carrying out and are still carrying on at the moment. And I'm in fairly regular contact with the specialist firm that we've engaged. And the final survey is one that I can't explain, but because it's a highly specialised area and is well beyond my expertise, but Professor Chris Brook from Nottingham University has been doing some specialist laser scanning to try and find samples of paint on the carvings in the leaves in the chapter house. We normally assume that medieval interiors of churches were richly painted and coloured, and a lot of that paint and colour has been removed over the years. There's been an assumption that this wasn't the case with the chapter house in Southwell. And indeed, in Nicholas Pevsner's description of the chapter house in his Buildings of England series, he actually states that fairly uniquely there was no paint used in the chapter house. Well, unfortunately for him, we can now say that he was wrong, and we've been able to, by very detailed laser scanning, establish that various paints were used on the leaves in the past, including gold leaf. And so we've got now the possibility of reinterpreting what the chapter house would have looked like in medieval times. And this specialist analysis using lasers, taking off samples and sending some samples off to university in Belgium to try and analyse what the paints were, will actually give us a new interpretation of the appearance of the chapter house before the Reformation. Here's an illustration of progress. One of the decisions we decided that we wanted to do was to put in new heating into the chapter house and get rid of the block of radiators which sit in the middle of the chapter house and restrict how you can use the space. And secondly, there's another set of radiators also within a timber enclosure in the narthex of the chapter house, just outside of the entrance. Both of them take up a lot of space and inhibit how we can use the space. I propose that what we would replace this with would be underfloor heating, which would require taking up the stone floor. We knew that the stone floor had been laid in Ewan Christian's big restoration of the cathedral in the 1880s. And I felt fairly relaxed about the idea of taking up the floor, and that was the reason why we wanted to investigate what was underneath the flags before we started. When we found that there was nothing of historical significance that we were going to damage in taking up the floors, we were able to develop the design proposals for how we carried out this work. So what you see here is a section of the floor that's been lifted. That broken and rubble stone is in fact just the mortar that the flags were sitting on, and had no significant historical importance. This next photograph shows you blocks of stone that have been lifted very carefully, and each one you'll just be able to make out numbered. We've completely surveyed the whole of the floor, and every stone has got its own individual number, and we have full-size drawings of the whole of the floor, coding all of those numbers onto it so that the floor can be put back precisely as it was, and I'll show you that in a minute or two. So the first major exercise for the contractors was to move in and put plastic sheeting over the walls to protect the carvings from dust, and then start to take up the floor, having numbered every block very, very precisely. Here's another progress photograph with approximately half of the floor now lifted. At the bottom right-hand side of the photograph, that little timber box that you see is sitting over where the radiators were in the middle of the chapter house, and has got in it more of the sensors that is recording the temperature and humidity so that we can understand moisture movement in the wall. And I'll talk a little bit more about what's happening in the middle in a second. There's the floor now completely lifted, apart from the circular section in the middle, which was underneath where the radiators are. Those black lines are the old water pipes which led from the boiler house, which is by the vestries in the cathedral, and led to the radiators, and they were about to be stripped out when that photograph was taken. Right at the bottom of the picture, you can see some of the original floor in place. Those of you who been into the chapter house will have noticed that as you walk in through the main entrance, there are three what look like gravestones laid into the floor, which we presume are for burials of medieval priests who were frequently buried in chapter houses in cathedrals and great churches. We don't know whether the burials are still in place or whether they were disturbed in the restoration of the chapter house, but we decided that we would leave them and leave that area of the floor in place rather than having to risk having to lift and deal with the archaeology associated with it. So one section of the floor was left in place. The other section of floor that we've left in place is that little circle of stone in the middle that's got the timber box on the top, and that area has now been removed, but was left to give a datum for relaying the floor to get the right levels. The next stage of work was to put some compressed sand over the rough slab that was underneath, and this is getting ready to put in the new heating. You can see two black and white cables lying on the floor. Those have got power cables in them and also data cables, because what we've arranged to do is to put a lot of power and also a lot of computer cables into the floor so that you can mount exhibitions or have concerts and have lighting plugged in various locations, or you can put in computer equipment if you wanted to put in education material or exhibition material. And so those are cables waiting to be connected to the new floor sockets, which I'll come back to again. And then in the middle, still that circular section of stone, which was directly underneath the radiators. And here's the heating going in. The heating is an underfloor heating system which will be relatively low temperature. It's not going to give you sitting room temperatures that you would expect in your own home, but you can make the space certainly warm enough for people to be able to attend concerts or lectures and the like. And the heating is powered off the original boilers in the cathedral, and is with hot water running through this whole circuitry of plastic pipes, which is going to be laid underneath the floor. These pipes have no connections in them, so that they will not leak, except for any connections in areas that we can get to through access panels. So it's a fairly foolproof way of providing low temperature heating across the whole of the floor space in the chapter house. And here's one of the electric boxes that I referred to, with power cables coming into it and also data cables. These are going to be disguised with stone covers on them, so they won't stand out as very ugly objects in the floor when we've finished the project. Moving on, the heating cables are then encased in concrete. Now, this isn't modern concrete. This is effectively what we call lime-based concrete, of the sort which the Romans used and have been used throughout history. And in fact, the hard concrete slab that we uncovered when we lifted the slabs is made of the same material, basically. So this is a historically correct way of making concrete and allows the moisture to breathe through it, and is going to give us a firm base for the new floor, which we now are putting back in this picture. So the concrete is set, and the radiating lines of stone, ribs of stone, which went from the centre of the chapter house, have been relaid, and gradually the masons are laying back the original blocks. And here's one of the full-size rubbing of the blocks that we took at the beginning of the project, so that each stone would go back precisely in the same position that it was before we took it up. And here's a more general view taken, and the central circular piece of stone has now been taken out, now that we've got the floor back. And the exhibition designers who we're working with proposed the idea of having a mirror located in the middle here, which would enable people to be able to look and examine the vault easily. So we've taken out the central circle of stone, and in its place are going to putting in an oak frame which has a mirror within it. And as an experiment, we tried by just using an ordinary mirror and laying it across the space to see the kind of view that you'd be able to get. The plan is that, and for those of you who would be guides taking people around the chapter house, the mirror will normally have an oak cover on it, which is going to be inscribed with a text on it. And then it has handles in it to lift the lid up, so that you can show people the mirror and they can examine the vaulting, but normally wouldn't be walking onto the glass of the mirror itself. So this was an experiment to see how well it worked. Now, those of you who know the chapter house well know that it's a wonderful space to get into, but one significant disadvantage is that it has a flight of steps from the archway from the choir aisle down into the passageway which leads into the chapter house. This is an illustration, a photograph taken standing in the slipe looking towards the choir with the 3 steps there, and the quite significant hindrance that presents if you're in a wheelchair or struggle with steps. The lottery, who given us a grant for doing this project, are very keen on access for all and enabling everybody to have free access into all areas of heritage interpretation and importance. And so we were left with the challenge: how do we get somebody in a wheelchair down from the choir into the chapter house? If we put a ramp in, it would be the whole length of that passageway and would severely damage the appearance of the space and cut across some of the carvings on the side of the wall. So after a lot of discussion, and part of the design team has been an access consultant, I don't know if you can read this drawing very well, we're actually putting in a lift which will sit in the floor and be almost invisible, but it's a little platform that you can wheel the wheelchair on, and then by pressing a control button would lift that section of the floor up and project you forward over the steps at the level of the floor level in the aisle of the choir. It's called a cantilever lift. They're relatively new technology, but are becoming more popular as a means of getting over steps in areas where you've got limited space. Most of the time, when it's not in use, the platform will be recessed into the floor. It's got stone on the top, and you won't see very much of it. But when you want to use it, somebody can wheel up to it. Either one of the vergers or a steward would press the control button, and it would lift you up over the steps or come up to meet you if you're still in the choir. So here's the installation actually going in place. It's not finished yet, but where that piece of plywood is on the right hand side of the picture is where the platform will sit, and you can see the paving slabs which have been relayed going up to the area where the platform will be, and the platform itself will have the original stones in. And then going across, we're relaying the stones, paving, to make those steps a little bit safer and easier to use. Another aspect of the chapter house is that there's no lighting in it at all at the moment. If you go in after sunset, it's completely dark. And if you want to have an event in there in the evening, you have to bring in temporary lighting. That's obviously a significant hindrance to usage, but also the vaulting and the upper level of carvings around the top of the windows are very difficult to see. So another element of the project has been to introduce lighting into the chapter house, and we've worked with a very experienced, very specialist firm of lighting designers who've worked with me on one or two other cathedral projects, led by a person called Bruce Kirk from a company called Light Perceptions. And I'm going to take you through now some slides which they prepared showing the lighting scheme which they are planning to introduce. Now, this illustration is very clever because it would appear that the project's finished because the radiators in the middle of the chapter house has been removed. That's just a sleight of hand of how they've doctored the photograph. This photograph was taken a couple of years ago before work started. So what are we doing with lighting? What they're planning to do, if you look very carefully, and I don't know if you can see, roughly halfway up the height of the windows, you can see a little black mark on the wall. That is where they're going to clamp onto the stonework without any drilling, light fittings which will shine up and down to illustrate the carvings and also to give general lighting in the space. So this is the first element of that, will be lights that will light up the upper level of carvings, which are at the near the top of the windows and can't be seen very easily from down below, and also light up onto the vaulting. The second one lights the carvings in the niches all the way around the lower part of the chapter house. And finally, a set of lighting which lights the floor of the chapter house, which would be for general use and as we see our way around. This is going to be very exciting because it will mean that we can present the chapter house in different kinds of ways and use some of the lights at certain times and some will be switched off, but the carvings can be enhanced and visitors will be able to see carvings in a way which they can't at the moment. We spent a lot of time with the lighting designers working out how to introduce this lighting with minimal visual impact, because we didn't want, for instance, to have lights suspended like chandeliers or something from the vault, because that would obscure the appreciation and purity of the space. But they come forward, which I think are very creative ways of using lighting with limited amount of impact visually by where the new fittings will go. Now, so far we've been concentrating on the chapter house itself. We're also, as part of the project, working on the outside to produce new external lighting around the whole of the cathedral. And those of you who've been to the cathedral recently over the last 3 or 4 months, or even just walked through the churchyard, will have seen trenches being dug and new cables being laid as part of an external lighting scheme. And I'm just going to show you 1 or 2 illustrations, again done by the same consultants, for lighting on footpaths and also floodlighting. These are 2 recent illustrations. On the left, a light which is actually set into the ground and will shine across the footpaths so that it makes it easier at night time to walk around the churchyard. And then on the right, a new standard lamp on a post, which has also got mounted on it new floodlighting to replace the very large floodlighting, now very antiquated floodlighting, which sits in the ground in large bunkers. With modern LED type lighting, you can actually have really quite discreet small floodlights which will be able to light up the key features of the minster. So here's their illustration of what the lighting is going to do. We're not lighting the whole of the minster at night time. It's been decided that we pick out key features, the ones that you can see from some distance. And this is an illustration of how it's planning to work. First of all, to light up the towers, the top of the towers at the west end, and also the crossing tower. These are 3 elements that you can see remotely across the town from quite a number of key vantage points. And I think will be very attractive at night time when they're lit up. And then secondly, the principal elevation that everybody gets excited about and that Pesner illustrated in his Buildings of England series is the west front. So we're providing floodlighting across the whole of the west front. But one small point to note, if you look at the west door underneath the big window, that's fairly dark. We found by doing a survey exercise that bats fly in that area, and if we were to overlight the area around the west door, that would be a disruption to bats, and bats are protected species, So we're keeping the light level around the west door relatively low. So here's an illustration of what the light fittings will look like. A footpath leading along the north side of the nave up to the north porch, as it is at present. And then there's, I don't know if you can, I'll go back, if you just look quickly, see the difference between the two photographs. This shows a standard lamp located, which will have floodlighting fitted to it, and also the black dots, slightly oversized actually on this illustration, are the mushroom lights which shine across the footpaths. This is a nighttime view with the footpaths illuminated so that your way up to the west, to the main door is illustrated. And also the standard lamps illustrated as well. This work is now at a fairly advanced stage, and in March we'll start to be able to switch on the lights and start trying out and setting the finer points of the detailing. Finally, I want to just concentrate on the last aspect of the project, which is perhaps the less exciting one, but extremely important, because what we've been able to do is to completely re-roof the choir of the cathedral. But first of all, I want to just take you into the roof space of the chapter house, an area which I guess not many of you will have been into. Over the vault in the chapter house is a chamber underneath the pyramid roof, which is difficult to access up a narrow staircase, but when you get there, has some wonderful carvings in its own right, little corblestones which support the timbers of the roof. These are not obviously as significant or important as the leaves inside the chapter house, but in their own right are really charming and wonderful late 13th century carvings in a space that was not intended to be highly illustrated. And I just thought you'd be interested to see that. So here's the roof. The roof of the cathedral at the western end, over the nave and over the transepts, are in lead and will have always been in lead through the whole of the history of the building. The roofs at the eastern end were in slate. We believe that they were re-roofed round about 1820, and what was almost certainly a lead roof was replaced with slate. We don't know, we haven't got any archive documentation to state why they changed from a lead roof to a slate roof. Possibly it was just that it was cheaper to do it when the roof needed repairing. But the roof now was starting to fail in places, and many of you might recall being inside the choir aisles where it's leaked through the vaulting. So what we proposed was taking off the slate roof and replacing it with lead, going back to its earlier proposal. And this is just two illustrations showing work in progress. To keep the cathedral dry, we put a temporary roof over the top, and the whole of the slate roof removed, the roof reboarded out with timber and lead introduced in its place, and renewing the gutters and doing a lot of masonry repairs. And so this is the roof as it's now finished. This part of the project was completed last in the middle of last year, and we're very pleased with the outcome. And this has given a roof that will last, I guess, 150 years or more, and it will be low maintenance and very easy to get to the gutters. So that's the chapter house story as it's going on at the moment. as I said, we are delighted to be working on it, partly because of the real significance of this building of international importance. As Pessner wrote in 1945, the Leaves of Southwell assume a new significance as one of the purest symbols surviving in Britain of Western thought, our thought in its loftiest mood. So if you wonder who's been talking to you, that's me in my COVID disguise, standing in the chapter house, feeling that this is much finer than York Minster. Among the chapter houses is the rose amongst the flowers. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Nick. That's great to see the project as it's evolved from through your eyes. And one of the brilliant things for the home team, as it were, the Minster staff who are working on the project, is having the opportunity to work alongside this team of experts and see these things from their perspective. And you talked about Bruce, who does the lighting, and there's the archaeologists and even the quantity surveyors and the builders. I mean, it's an amazing team, and it really is a fascinating process. So this is the point where we invite questions. I can see there are a couple of hands up. I'm going to be monitoring the hands up, and Aoife's going to be monitoring the chat. So if we start with, oh, John Gill, there's a familiar name. I think it must be our previous dean, I think. John, would you like to unmute and ask your question?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can.
Right, well, just wanted to really say hello, everybody, and congratulations to Nick and the whole team. I think it's fantastic, absolutely fantastic. Unfortunately, I haven't been able to be with you on some of your previous talks, but it came across superbly. And I just look forward to the day when we're out of this pandemic and we can come and look at the chapter house in the flesh again. So congratulations, one and all. One tiny thing, and I totally understand why the woodwork has been taken away from the radiators. Nick, you said there would be a quotation on the new oak work in the middle for the mirror. Is that going to take forward George Herbert's words that were there before, or are they disappearing?
No, they're not the same words, but the cover over the radiator has been in place for at least a century. We have an illustration, well, a little bit of background. The heating system inside the cathedral, throughout the whole of the cathedral, was installed in 1919. So all the radiators, all the big pipes that go around were installed at that time. And the radiators that were in the chapter house were installed at that time and encased in a timber cover with the George Herbert text painted on it. What we have found is photographs prior to 1919, when the timber was actually just a plain table with nothing underneath it, which sat in the middle of the chapter house. But we actually believe that that timber comes from a tester, from a pulpit. So there is some significance and historical association to the timber work. So it's been carefully dismantled, and we're just working out where to put it for the future. But it's not going to be the same text. The text that is chosen, and I'm struggling because I ought to know what it is actually from one of the Psalms and relates to water and with the idea that the mirror reflects the wells that are in the area of the cathedral.
Oh, thank you very much, and congratulations again to everybody.
Thank you, John. It's lovely to hear your voice.
There we are, across the waves.
Yes. Aoife, would you like to pick up on something in the chat?
Yeah. So is there any investigation into the acoustics of the space?
the simple answer is no. The space is actually quite small and the acoustics actually are quite good. One of the things about these polygonal chapter houses that are fairly unique to England, a lot of chapter houses in the continent are actually rectangular spaces, and some English ones are, like Ely and so on. But the acoustics are fairly good. So if today's event were to be run in the flesh, in the chapter house, I probably wouldn't need any kind of sound amplification for people to hear. But what we hope to be able to do is to be able to use it for small concerts. We've done drawings showing how we can get 50 or 60 seats laid out, not COVID secure, this is post-COVID, so that we can have concerts and so on in there. And it'll be interesting to find out how the acoustic works, say for a quartet or something like that. But at the moment, we haven't done work on that because we think the natural acoustic is fairly good.
Thank you. I have a hand up. I've got Will Harrison's hand up. If Will would like to unmute and ask the question.
Hi, Nick. We've already been in a meeting this morning, so I'm sorry it's me again. I just wondered about the seats, which go, the canon seats, which are around the edge of the chapter house, and whether the intention is to return those. You've talked a lot about purity, and I get that very much, but is the plan to return those seats?
There is. It's not actually been discussed. The seats are loose fitting, effectively. I see no reason why they can't be brought back in. The purity of the space isn't damaged by that. You can read the stonework without any damage with that. I think that's a discussion actually that chapter need to have about the seats.
Thank you. Over to Aoife again, please.
Are there any plans to try and show how the leaves in the chapter house would have originally been looked when they were painted, like with lights or something like that?
I think that's...
Can I just ask you, have you turned your camera off? Because I think we seem to have lost you. It might just be the connection, yeah.
No,
It might be you, Diana, because I can't see you.
Oh, okay, no, somebody's just messaged me to say can't see Nick. Oh, I can see you again now. Sorry, it's probably me. Do apologise.
The issue, the work that Christopher Brooks has been doing is actually revealing the concept that the chapter house was painted. A common assumption has been up till now that it wasn't. And so in a sense, this is new knowledge. We don't know how much paint, coloured paint there was. There's evidence of gold leaf being used on key details and so on. So I think it is something that can be explored. We wouldn't dare to put any paint onto any of the stonework, but through other interpretation material, there would be the opportunity of that. But at the moment, we actually haven't got enough evidence to actually say this is the paint scheme. Were all the leaves painted the same level of green? Were stalks painted brown? We haven't got that level of information. What we've got at the moment are tiny fragments that actually people haven't noticed until they've been using magnification equipment and so on to see that there has been paint on there in the past.
Thank you. Yeah, we had Professor Brooks spoke to us. I think it was just our second talk back in January about the research he's been doing. We're not able to have his recorded talk live on YouTube all the time, but if you'd be interested to see that, do let us know, because I will ask him if we can share it again, and we never know. But that was fascinating, and he's actually had somebody who specialises in medieval art doing a painting so that it looks a little bit like what they imagine it would be based on the sampling. Martin, would you like to be next? Unmute.
Hello, can you hear me?
Can hear you.
Right. Nick, Thank you very much. Very interesting. But did you take the opportunity of drilling any core holes through the old dense concrete flooring? And if not, why not?
Well, I'm glad to say we did. We didn't drill. When we did the initial investigation, we lifted the slab, not knowing what the stone slabs that we walk on sat on. We didn't know if they were on bare earth. We didn't know if we were going to find any burials. We found this concrete, and it's got bits of brick and other stone in it as aggregate. It's absolutely rock hard, but in one area, we dug through it, a hole about 4 inches square. It took it took 2 men 2 days to get through, and we just got down to bare earth effectively underneath. So the answer to that was yes, we did, but when we got down through it, we decided that there really we weren't going to learn a lot unless we were to take the whole lot up, which we saw no need to, because it's actually in good enough condition to be reused.
Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, Aoife.
So we've got a question. Do you know whether the Minster has any plans to change its heating system away from the dependence on fossil fuels?
Yeah, well, that is the policy. It's heating of cathedrals is a very big and very problematic issue. The Church of England has a policy to actually divest completely from fossil fuels. At the moment, our boilers are gas boilers, so we've got to go quite a long way. The real problem that we have is finding an alternative system that can cope with the volume of space. The building is highly inefficient. All that we're interested in inside the cathedral is warming the bottom 6 feet, because that's how tall we are. But we've got acres of space above us that are absorbing all the heat. All the heat that we put in at ground level rises up to the top and sits there. How we produce alternatives is the big challenge. My personal view is I don't think we'll ever actually be able to produce highly efficient heating within the cathedral. It's just such a big, inefficient building. But what we can do is obviously to make sure that what energy we do use, we use as efficiently as possible. And about 8 years ago or so, we actually did replace all the boilers with new, highly efficient ones. So that was one small step. Eventually, it might well be that we can actually heat hot water using other renewable resources. But at the moment, things like solar power doesn't have the output to heat enough hot water that would heat the cathedral. We might revert to some kind of electric heating in the future. That might be a possibility. But at the moment, I think we would struggle. My personal view is that everybody who's watching this Zoom talk now, if we all go back and say, what are we doing in our own homes? They're easier to solve. Smaller buildings are easier to solve. And if we did that, we'd have a huge impact anyhow on energy consumption. And a few buildings, few precious big buildings, might always have to.
Thank you, Nick. Yes, I always wondered what.
Can we just add on? Sorry, one quick thing. The one thing we can do is possibly to have ground source heat pumps, which are effective huge boreholes driven into the ground, and we've got a lot of churchyard around us. Manchester Cathedral has done that, and 80% of its heating for Manchester Cathedral now comes out of renewable from the heat pumps in the ground. That is probably the way that we might be able to go in the future. It's extremely expensive, the technology at the moment, but I think eventually we might be able to do that.
Exciting, that would be. Thank you. So it's 3 o'clock, but there seems to be quite a few questions. So if you're happy, Nick, for another 5 minutes or so, is that okay? Take a couple more questions. Yeah. Tony Morris has a hand up. Hello, Tony. Would you like to unmute? I can't. Oh, there we go. Oh, I think the hand's gone down. Okay, we'll go to David Mitchell then, please.
I just wondered whether you were doing any sensitive stone or even glass cleaning while you have the opportunity.
Yes, I missed that out. We very shortly we've got a team of stone conservators coming in who are cleaning. In fact, they're in this week. But this week and next week, they're 2 weeks, and then they're going, and then they're going to come back again. And they're doing cleaning, fairly delicate cleaning. A lot of work was done in the. So this is really to follow up on that. They're also going to do some pointing of vulnerable areas to protect the stonework where mortar has failed, and so on. So that is good. That is part of the project, and we're using a specialist company called Skillington Workshop, who are down near Grantham, who are going to come in and do that for us. So yes, we are. Was another question there, Sonny? No.
Glass, I think glass is.
Glass, yes. No, we're not working on the glass. Is relatively modern, apart from the fragments of medieval glass that are set into the chapter house, and all that we're going to do is we've got scaffolding up inside the chapter house, and we'll be able to have the opportunity to just clean it down gently. Really not much more than dusting. We don't think we need to do any specialist conservation work on the glass at the moment.
Thank you. Yes, the latest photos that came through, we've got some rather spectacular scaffolding in there at the moment, haven't we, Nick? For the purposes of allowing access to the top level for cleaning.
Yeah, we're cleaning the vault at the moment, and it's quite big places, so that should have a very good impact when it's done.
Aoife, should we have another question from the chat?
Yeah, this is the last question in the chat. Is there any good security for the lead roofing?
Two things. Having a dean living on site. We haven't experienced lead theft at the cathedral. Hang on a minute. From the roofs. The building is really quite high. To get up there is quite a challenge. We've had sections of lead pipe, rainwater pipes stolen. The new external lighting around the churchyard, including on the footpaths, will actually help to be a slight deterrent. But at the moment, we don't think we need to protect the roofs. Half the cathedral roofs have always been lead, and we've not had issues of lead theft. So we're not worried about that. It's the rainwater pipes at low level that have been stolen in the past, and unfortunately, some of those are still in plastic where we've done temporary repairs. But I'm not particularly worried about high level roofs. They're so high up that lead thieves, if they get up there, they deserve to have the lead, I think.
Never get it down.
All right, shall we just take one more question? Is that all right, Nick, from John Anderson?
Yes, two things. One is I know one church which has far infrared heating, which heats the people and not the floor or the air, and that's electric, of course. My question is there a loop system in the chapter house? Because I'm very deaf and no chapter houses I know don't have loop systems, much to my fury.
The answer is, the simple answer is no. That might be an oversight, and I'd have to go and have a quick chat with the rest of the team about that. The one thing that we can do, and we have thought about, is because we've got good power supplies going in, we can put in temporary loops if we needed to for an event. I think that's something I think I may need to go and have a chat with one or two others about, actually. Yeah, I think it's a good question.
Thank you.
Good question. Thank you. Thank you for your questions, everybody. And Nick, huge thank you to you for joining us today. I can see Tom giving a little round of applause there. As you know, we don't make a charge for these talks, but we are inviting donations. You've probably seen on some of the confirmation emails that you've had. And we just wanted to let you know how much we appreciate your generosity in your donations. Our income has massively dropped during the pandemic, so it's very kind of you and we appreciate your support. Aoife is going to be sending an evaluation form to you. It's not a very long one, we promise, shouldn't take more than 5 minutes to fill in. We do read every single comment very carefully and analyse them so that it can help us inform future sessions. And also, if you have any ideas for future talks, things that you'd like to hear a bit more about, please do let us know. Our next talk is on the 9th of March, where we're going to be focusing on the historical context of the Green Man and its significance in the higher Gothic period. So looking forward to that. And there's information and booking on the events page of the website. If you are interested in being added to a mailing list so that you hear about these directly, please email Aoife and she'll add you. I'd just like to finally thank Nick one more time for a really interesting talk. Really good to see you. And obviously to the National Lottery Heritage Fund for providing the funds to ensure that this wonderful building is conserved into the next generations. It's a great responsibility, I think, to be a part of this team that's doing that. Hope to see you again next time, everybody. It's been great to see so many people with us, and yeah, goodbye from us.